Pardon my computerized voice, but I have some health issues that make speaking difficult. As you will hear, the computer tends to mangle some names. My apologies. Welcome. Thank you to everyone for attending this virtual event celebrating Dr. Montse Feu's book Fighting Fascist Spain, Worker Protest from the Printing Press, published by the University of Illinois Press in 2020. This is the final event of our CHSS Diversity and Inclusion Committee events commemorating Hispanic Heritage Month. I am Dr. April Shemak and I am an associate professor in the Department of English and I work on Caribbean literature, U.S. ethnic and post-colonial studies, and I am very interested in what Dr. Feu has to say in her book about how anarchist and socialist Spanish immigrants in the United States used the periodical Español Libre to fight oppression. There is much to learn from this book about how these Spanish immigrants protested the fascism that had taken hold across the Atlantic in Spain in the 1930s. This is something that we can learn a lot from to fight current fascism in the United States and elsewhere. On to our speakers. As you know, Dr. Feu is an associate professor of Spanish in the Department of World Languages and Cultures. In addition to Dr. Feu, we are fortunate to be joined by two other scholars of radicalism. Dr. Jorell Melendez-Badillo is an assistant professor of history at Dartmouth University, and Dr. Kenyon Zimmer is an associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Arlington. We will put their full biographies on the screen so that I won't use time to go over their remarkable achievements, but please read them on the screen and they can also be found online. I will ask each speaker first to make a few comments about why they chose to become a professor. This would be especially helpful for our students to hear. So, speakers, what made you decide to become a professor?
Answering, is that okay? So why I became a professor and my interest, right? So I was the kid that always was asking why, and my parents were working long hours, so they figured out if that they bought an encyclopedia by installments, that would keep me busy. So I kept reading that encyclopedia over and over again, and I actually made zines and periodicals and magazines to sell with my friends, you know, and so that got me started on knowing, you know, the humanities and knowing why. But basically I was kind of on my own because I'm first generation, so nobody in my family went to university, let alone primary or secondary education, because the post-war for Catalans in Spain was really, really tough. For my parents was awful because they couldn't speak Catalan. So therefore I was like on my own. But when I went to school, my professors, my teachers, my colleagues have really uplifted me. So it's only because of free education in Spain and for grants and fellowships in Spain and in the United States, and also for colleagues that have always supported me, that I'm here. Otherwise I wouldn't be here. So that's the only reason why I'm a professor, and I enjoy doing that with my students. I get very sad when I see that these opportunities are fading away for our students today. It's very heartbreaking.
The other speakers want to say anything now about what led you to become a professor?
I can go, Kenyon, if you don't mind. First, I wanted to say thank you to Dr. April Shemak for the introduction, for that generous introduction, and also to Rita Benelli Atkinson for all her work putting this together. Also, Kenyon, it's been a long time since I've seen him. So thank you, Montse, for the invitation. And it's an honor to be honoring you tonight. And so my journey to becoming a professor is similar to yours, actually, Montse. I come from a working class background, first generation. I grew up with my grandparents. They only got to 4th grade. And we had no books. I remember growing up in a house without books. The only book was the Bible. and then an encyclopedia that they bought from a seller that dropped in one day, and they invested and they paid it installments. And so I remember that I was passionate about reading that encyclopedia and everything that was inside of it. But I did not know about college. I didn't know what college. I was a horrible student when I was in high school. I almost flunked high school. It was a blurb. And I remember I was bored in classes, but I had really amazing professors and teachers who were historians and actually took an interest in me as a person and not necessarily in my grades. And so they pushed me to go to college. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I did not know how college worked. But once I went in, I knew that I want to be a historian like those teachers. And I'll talk a little bit more about this and what I'm going to read later on. But also, I come from the punk community. And so listening to punk and that ethos of the DIY, and then meeting colleagues such as Montse Feu and Kenyon Zimmer, who for me are the embodiment of punk rock in terms of their kindness towards scholars, younger scholars. I found a community of people like them that really inspired me to be a professor. So that's my journey to get here.
You inspire us too, Jorell, always.
So my journey was a bit different. I grew up in a tiny town of about 500 people on the California coast. And I spent most of middle school and high school dreaming of becoming a comic book illustrator. So I didn't quite end up there, but that will become relevant later. But my senior year of high school, I'd never been particularly interested in history. But then I sort of had a breakthrough moment my senior year of high school. I had a very wonderful, energetic high school history teacher who introduced me to books like A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, or Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Loewen, which really like blew my mind by making me realize that history wasn't just names and dates, and historians didn't just repeat names and dates and the same stories over and over, but that what historians do is actually debate and come up with new interpretations and new explanations. So history is constantly evolving, and that there are different ways of telling history, and that there are huge swaths of history that you don't typically learn, and that still are awaiting historians. And Montse has found one of those areas with this book. And then, yeah, so from, I went to college. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do art or social sciences, and then sort of midway through took a hard turn into academic history, while at the same time becoming sort of a campus activist. So those two interests in like activism and history combined into the history of radical activism, and here I am.
Thank you. Thank you for all the responses and information, and for sharing your journey. So for the rest of the program, each invited speaker is going to talk for about 10 minutes. Actually, I should say each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes. So we'll go with Dr. Melendez-Badillo, Dr. Zimmer, and then Dr. Feu will talk. So I'll just turn it over to them unless there were other comments from Rita or the presenters. Okay.
No,
So
I think you're good.
okay.
Okay, so should I go ahead and start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. So so I'm just going to be reading from a document so I don't go over my 10 minutes. So if I do go over, please let me know. Again, I am really humbled and honored to be in this space with everyone celebrating Montse Feu's book. When I decided to embark in a career in academia, that is when I decided to pursue my doctoral degree. Both Dr. Montse Feu and Dr. Kenyon Zimmer were of great importance to me. Not only did their scholarship inspire me in so many ways, but they were always supportive and solidary. I often say that I entered academia through punk rock and through the punk community. That entailed following an ethos of DIY, meaning do it yourself, and also with the attitude of killing your idols. I learned that through basement shows, right? It was through punk that I developed an understanding about history and of anarchism. And that's where I got actually interested in knowing a bit more about anarchism in Puerto Rico, where I'm from, right? To my surprise, not much had been written about it. So when I decided to embark on my research about anarchism, I met generous and solidary people like Montse and Kenyon and Jesse Cohn, who also wrote down in the chat, and I'm glad that he's here with us because he was also crucial in that community. For me, those people were the embodiment of punk rock in academia. And I still think that way, right? These were the people that did not care if I had a degree or not, but took my work seriously and engaged with it. Their work inspired me and still does, and it provides a compass for the type of scholarship that I want to produce and the type of scholar that I want to be. But I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here to celebrate Montse Feu's amazing book, Fighting Fascist Spain. The book is a tour de force that can be located and makes crucial interventions in multiple fields of study, is an important contribution to the history of anarchism in the United States, to histories of print media, histories of anti-fascist organizing, and global histories of the Spanish Civil War, considered by many, including myself, as the Spanish Revolution. Perhaps one of the most important and innovative things that Feu's book offers is its methodological plurality. The world the Spanish immigrants created and navigated was vast. In her work, Feu uses las Sociedades Hispanas Confederadas and the newspaper España Libre to uncover a wide network of individuals, venues, and political campaigns. To make sense of all these things, Feu uses an interdisciplinary lens that pays attention to cartoons, radio shows, theatrical plays, chronicles, and editorials, among many other things. This impressive range of sources demonstrates the depth and sophistication of Feu's scholarship. As a scholar of anarchism and working class histories in the Caribbean and Latin America, Dr. Feu's book is an exemplary book for my work. Much like Kenyon Zimmer's path-breaking book, Immigrants Against the State, another highly influential book, Fighting Fascist Spain is a masterclass on how to engage with working class knowledge production. For those that participated in the anti-fascist network that Dr. Feu uncovers, their literary and print production was a serious affair. In fact, for Spanish immigrants, it was a matter of life and death, not only for them, but for those back in Spain. Feu's book is a beautiful example of how a scholar can engage with such complexities and with rigorous analysis of workers' print production. In my work, I'm interested in unpacking the transnational circulation of knowledge from the standpoint of working class intellectual communities. And Montse Feu's book, I repeat it again, is a masterclass in how to do this. She's able to weave together a compelling and impressive narrative about a complicated story of how España Libre served as a living and vibrant archive of what was happening in Spain, as well as to connect those immigrant and activists to international anti-fascist struggles with immigrants throughout the country. The book is also very timely. One could say that it offers an unspoken history of the United States. That is, Jose González Malo, Aurelio Pego, and Carmen Aldecoa are not household names or names that you will find in traditional US history textbooks. But as Dr. Feu demonstrates in her book, they were crucial in the formation of national and transnational communities in the United States. In this work, Montse joins a host of other scholars like Kenyon Zimmer, Susana Sueiro Seoane, Jesse Cohn, Chris Castañeda, Tom Goyens, and Jennifer Guglielmo, among many others. This book is also timely because it yields light to the history of fascism in Spain and how workers, radicals, and intellectuals in the United States organized support and solidarity campaigns for those fighting across the Atlantic Ocean. This is of utmost importance given the pejorative meaning that the term anti-fascism and its short Antifa has acquired in the current political lexicon. It is a powerful reminder of the dangers of fascism, but it also tells a powerful story of the multiple ways that people gave their lives, their time, and their resources to combat fascism on a local and international scale. It is also a powerful reminder about the multiple ways that we can combat fascism in the streets, in the classrooms, and through the print word. Again, for me, it is an honor to be in this virtual space with all of you to celebrate such an outstanding book. So congratulations on your book, Montse.
All right. Similarly, I am delighted to be part of this event and to honor this accomplishment. I'm going to share my screen here. So bear with me for just a moment. So I want to start by briefly pointing out a strange and unexpected connection that goes back to my story about how I became a historian. This is me back in high school, when maybe I looked a little bit more punk rock. I was an avid collector and reader of comic books. That's part of why I wanted to be a comic book illustrator at the time. In an era long before there were good comic book movies and it was cool to read comics. One of the titles I read was called Gru the Wanderer, and it was co-written and illustrated by Sergio Aragones. So Aragones, right, you can see here, his name is on that cover. And this is from an era when it was very rare for comic book creators to have their names on the covers. Because he was famous. He was famous as an illustrator for Mad Magazine, where he did these irreverent, anti-authoritarian cartoons such as this one. And now I have only learned through Montse's research that Aragones, at the very same time he was making his career at Mad Magazine, was drawing explicitly anti-fascist cartoons for the paper España Libre. And he was so he is here in her book, and he was in fact a dedicated radical and anti-fascist, which was the foundations of his irreverent humor, which made him famous through other means like Mad Magazine. So all of this was, this strange like recursion back to my youth in a certain sense. And there's all sorts of other unexpected connections, figures who appear in the course of this narrative who are prominent in the civil rights movement and civil liberties, all sorts of things. It's really fascinating. And it goes to show how much, that this is really a hidden history that Montse documents, a history that was hidden even to people like myself who have spent a couple decades researching the history of anarchism and immigration in the United States. And I knew literally nothing about this organization or the paper España Libre. I did not even know it existed until finding Montse's work. So just to give one example, to the extent that most Americans know or learn much about the Spanish Civil War, it's in the context of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, right? American volunteers who went and fought against fascism in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. You might say that in sort of its typical American fashion, that we tend to make it about ourselves and not in fact the Spaniards. And not knowing that as Fighting Fascist Spain documents, there was this entire community of Spanish anti-fascist exiles who constituted the, in sort of the grand scheme of things, probably a more significant anti-fascist organization than the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. and also constitute, as Jorell mentioned, this hidden history this hidden chapter in the history of anarchism in the United States. Right, the Sociedades Hispanas Confederadas was active from the 1930s to the 1970s. Really, sort of the low point in the history of anarchism in the United States and elsewhere, and they are this thread of continuity and of really continued activism that's gone completely unnoticed, and revises our and my understanding of anarchism and American radicalism in those sort of Cold War decades, those lost decades. There's also very much a people's history, right? A history from below, which also then harks back to my high school and reading Howard Zinn and getting introduced to this notion of people's history or history from below, right? Where we look at and examine how sort of everyday individuals or non-elite individuals and, you know, workers and minorities and women like made significant historical change. And España Libre is, you know, a residual evidence of people's history. To quote briefly from the book, España Libre underlined the importance of people's history. Franco's rule had a devastating effect on workers in Spain. Not only were workers' unions suppressed and their leaders either shot or sent to prison or to exile, but their political activities and archives were censored and destroyed. So in the United States, this newspaper and the organization around it was helping to rescue this history that was literally being eliminated, and people who were literally being eliminated in fascist Spain. And now we're in sort of a second wave of recovery, as Montse has been able to recover these from that initial effort of recovery. And as she says elsewhere in the book, examining this history shows us mutual aid, collective action, self-empowerment, self-management, and cultural production, again, of largely, you know, regular working class people. People who, I should point out, were able to raise between 1939 and 1977 more than $4 million in donations to aid victims of Spanish fascism. That's $4 million raised in the course of a few decades, again, raised from working class immigrants to aid victims of fascism, which is just an extraordinary accomplishment. I want to read one more quote. This is what Feu writes about a woman named Carmen Aldecoa Gonzalez, who was briefly the editor of España Libre in the mid-1960s. But I think this excerpt could be as much about Montse herself as it is about Aldecoa Gonzalez. She says that in her writings, she criticizes elitist and colonial perspectives that disregarded the historical contributions of common people in Spain and in the Americas. And to document proletarian print culture, Aldecoa makes sure to list the names of those involved in writing and editing periodicals, which is very much what you see here in the book. And she is troubled that such periodicals were not being preserved, and thus the historical legacy of the workers was being lost. Therefore, Aldecoa invites scholars to consult the archives of proletarian journals and examine workers' writings from this era, which again is very much what Montse herself has done, both in the book and in projects to preserve print culture outside of this book. So I find that a very particularly relevant excerpt. And I just wanted to very briefly hit upon, again, echoing what Jorell said about the contemporary relevance of this book, highlighting two areas. One of those is history of refugees and refugee law and illegality, because as the book documents, particularly in chapter 4, right, a lot of these refugees were not recognized legally as refugees in the United States. Refugee laws were very strict. The United States had this devil's bargain with Franco as part of the Cold War. And we have a history of refugee rights activism in this book. And of course, also the history of anti-fascism, which Jorell already touched upon. So I will just wrap it up there very quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmer. Montse, do you want to take it away?
Yes,
Thank you very much for your words and for coming here. I feel loved, and I'm so happy for having been able to build these trusting relationships and caring relationships. And also, and mostly, I feel very happy for the Confederadas. They deserve this day. They deserve this recording. Lots of them, because I read their letters and I read their papers. I slept 4 hours a day after working long hours on a factory so that the victims were not forgotten. So I think we're doing a great service talking about them, and I'm very happy we're doing that. So I'm gonna share with you a timeline I did. It's just a brief introduction to the book so that then you can enjoy it yourself, so I don't give too much away, if that's okay. So let me share my screen. And I'll go here. And here's what it is. This is from my webpage, and I'm going to read with you because sometimes my pronunciation, you know, so this you can read with me alongside, right? So Fighting Fascist Spain examines modern Spanish immigrants to the United States in their fight against fascism through the narrative arc of the periodical España Libre. Spanish immigrants represented one of the most radical ethnic groups, rooted either in the anarchism or socialism of their homeland. In the United States, these workers continued to participate in vigorous transnational and radical countercultures, which became one of their main strengths on their anti-fascist sentiment during the Spanish Civil War and the Francisco Franco dictatorship. Spanish cultural and mutual aid societies came together in what was known as the Sociedades Hispanas Confederadas. It grew, it was an organization that grew to 200 affiliated associations in the United States. The Confederadas periodical, I use Confederadas because that's how they would call themselves. The Confederadas periodical, España Libre, articulates how workers' culture and politics shape their anti-fascism. Using extensive and previously ignored or disregarded literary, visual, and archival sources, this project explores abounding anarchist literature and anti-fascist humor. Workers' public protest was fashioned by a system of traditions and institutions, the grassroots associations, the mutual aid, the alternative press, the comic and the farcical theater that provided many opportunities for anarchist practice and humorous anti-fascism. Thanks to the grant of the US Latino Digital Humanities, preserving.
I'm sorry, Montse, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we can't see the PowerPoint. Or
Not cool. Thank you for interrupting me. So I'm not sure why. Let me try again. So let me stop the sharing. Oh, the host disabled my sharing. So I need to be able to share. So that's why. Sorry about that. Thank you for interrupting me.
Rita, can you do that?
You should be able to share.
Okay.
It must have taken it away from you when you gave it to me. Sorry.
Right. No worries, no worries. I just didn't realize. So I think now you can see it, yes? Yeah. So I read just this. It's gonna be posted online in my webpage, so you'll see it, okay? Sorry about that. So I hope you followed. This is just the introduction. Then I'm sharing this image from Frente Popular that was a precursor to España Libre. And thanks to the grant from US Latino Digital Humanities, I'm preserving this online. The archive, the digital archive will be live next year. So, or this year, I don't know, whenever we have it ready. So thanks to that, I'm doing that. And actually my research started in the US recovery project that they supported my PDA and my dissertation on the newspapers. So on July 18th, 1936, the same day that the Spanish military attempted to seize control of the country's major cities, Jesus Arenas, a Galician immigrant who would become one of the Confederadas' founding members, stepped out of the steamship Oriente and onto the docks of New York. The anarchist sojourner found the political atmosphere tense among the workers' organizations in New York as a result of the news about a military coup in Spain. By July 25th, only a week after the uprising, the Ateneo Hispano had become the workers' center of anti-fascist operations and held its first fundraising event, an inspirational speech by Luis Tugadi Garmendia. That same month, the Comité Antifascista Español began publishing Frente Popular, the precursor to España Libre. As Kenyon was saying, there is a lot of comics that I'm also recovering for this digital project, and there are some in the book. Although there were other anti-fascist and pro-Spanish Republic periodicals in the United States, none were published by workers' organization for the entire period of Francisco Franco rule or until elections were held again in Spain in 1977. España Libre was the anti-fascist community's paper that served as a forum, as an organizing tool. They protested on the page, rallied in the streets, and fundraised for prisoners, refugees, and the clandestine resistance in Spain. It created an inclusive anti-fascist community that extended beyond the United States. Actually, there were 500 copies of España Libre smuggled into Spain regularly. Also, these are some of the it grew to 265,000 members. These are pictures from the book with the list of organizations. So we see there is a hub of different, the Sociedades Confederadas really were sitting on the shoulders of previous migrants organizations. So it's the anarchists, the Hispanic, the labor communities that all got together and brought together migrants and exiles who became leaders in publishing censored news and proletarian culture, helping the victims of fascism. The Confederadas generated its own non-institutionalized modes of collective action and allied with US and Spanish labor unions, ethnic groups, intellectuals, alternative press, and progressive political groups against fascism. It built intersectional thought and action, but cooperation did not impact its bottom-up organizational approach. The Confederadas' labor, artistic, educational, and intellectual practices first developed in these earlier workers' associations and would be maintained by the Confederadas throughout its existence. Spanish fascism. Early on, workers wrote about the Spanish fascism in Frente Popular and España Libre. Contributors denounced the national Catholicism, the fascist violence, and military power that kept Franco in power, cleansed the nation of dissenters, and terrorized the population. In 1914, editor Jesus González Malo reminded readers that anarchists and socialists failed to unite. Communists and Russia served as a justification for a fascist Spain, and the liberal democracies allowed it to happen. Decades later, España Libre continued publishing articles of anarchist papermen exiled around the world. From Buenos Aires, Manuel Villar Mingo expressed the despair felt by Spaniards over the seeming permanence of fascism in Spain. For the Spaniards, the long night that began in April 1939 remained impenetrable in its darkness. It seems that we belong to another world, inhabitants of another planet, that our destiny counts little. For the Spaniards, Hitler won the war. That was published in 1960 in España Libre. So this picture, Kenyon, Dr. Zimmer also show from the book. We have the common demonstration, especially in Madison Avenue, because it was the office of the Spanish diplomats. The Confederadas moved from radical politics marked by the Spanish Revolution to collective action based on inclusive print culture and solidarity in multi-ethnic and transnational networks of action. The way this unprecedented anti-fascist culture developed and adapted to US exile, as well as its tireless solidarity, demonstrates members' flexibility and organizational skills. We also see the photos of the anti-fascist plays They were composed by members and as fundraising events. Members and contributors participated in the reporting on censored news about fascist Spain, calls to action, graphic art, cartoons, literature, and theater, which enlarged members' comprehension of Spanish fascist myths of social cleansing, perfection, and power. España Libre vindicated workers' culture and politics in exile and represented members' post-war ethnic identity in the United States through this diverse body of cultural work. And my last slide, just to finish up rounding the main ideas, fighting fascist Spain counters the erasure of common people and social history and literature, and shows how intellectual and political ideas, as well as culture, are transferred collectively from below. España Libre carefully documented the politics and culture of workers, supported exiles and refugees, uncompromisingly condemned and mocked fascist power and violence, and published inquisitive playfulness. This effective engagement allowed anti-fascists to laugh at themselves, care for each other, and cooperate for peace, even knowing that their contributions would be appropriated, forgotten, or misunderstood. The periodical offers these needed lessons in avoiding societies where fascism can be reproduced and normalized.
Thank you, Dr. Feu. And I think because there have been some really great questions, we'll start in the chat. We'll start with those. And Rita, did you want to read them, or how do you want to go about doing this?
Yeah, that works. So some of these questions are just going to be slightly edited because we only have about 15 minutes for a Q&A. So we'll start with some of the ones that we've gotten. So Jorell, there is a question for you. Basically the question was, could you discuss the role of España Libre during the transición? And then related to that, was this the free Spain that they had anticipated?
I think that the question, the better answer would be given by Montse in regards to España Libre. So I would let Montse, if she likes, to answer the question, because I don't feel I have the authority to answer.
No, not at all. We can help each other. So I say some, and then maybe you want to add some more. I mean, I don't know overreaching knowledge. I only know the knowledge from the people I recovered. So I'm the voice of this community, and I hope I represent them well. So in my understanding, what they felt in the transición, so the question means from the dictatorship to the democracy in Spain, they felt, they always talk about traición, right? It was a treason because the anarchist work was never recognized, right? Obviously, not being a party, it was not included in how doing the new constitution, how deal with exile, and even in academia, the anarchist is always misrepresented and not being included on all the contributions they made. So they knew, that's why I said in the last slide, not only they knew during the transition, but before the transition happened, there's one article that I quote in the book that they knew this was going to happen. They knew they would be erased from history, but they say that was not important. What was important was doing the good fight, and the good fight is what they should be doing. So that's why it's important that we give them voice, and I try to do it as well as I can.
Okay, and we have another question that I think all of you can answer, which is, could you say something about how you teach your students both to critique their foreparents and also to stand on their shoulders and push their work forward?
So I think that question came from Donna Gabacha, who was one of my mentors when I was a graduate student and writing my dissertation. which makes this an interesting question to answer in this context. But I think, Donna, what you're asking is about sort of academic for parents and not like activist for parents. So if I'm wrong, correct me. But in that sense, in terms of teaching students to both appreciate and question historians who have gone before them. Yeah, I mean, I think I do that. I certainly encourage. I especially encourage students to try to push beyond me and my own work whenever they can, and also outside, other scholars elsewhere who are working on histories of radicalism, who are opening up new areas or gently correcting things I have published that turn out to be incorrect, or expanding into new areas. And my attitude, it has always been to share as many resources and as much information as I can. I'm definitely of the approach. I definitely have the perspective that there is far too much work that still needs to be done, and I do not have nearly enough time. So I am more than happy to help other people expand and explore areas, especially those that I don't necessarily have the knowledge or the linguistic capacities to explore to their fullest extent. So I have always, I am not a jealous scholar, I guess. I don't try to protect my little fiefdom. I like to invite people in as much as I can. And I'll shut up now and let other people talk.
I can jump there. I think that in my work, I do Caribbean history, Puerto Rican history. I was trained under Blanca Silvestrini, and she pioneered the field of women's working class history in Puerto Rico in the 1970s. And so she was one of the pioneers, and she was part of this generation that started thinking history from below in Puerto Rico as part of this larger trend in the social sciences and in social history. And so I see my work as a tribute all the time. Everything I produce is a tribute to the people that came before me. And so I start my work thinking it is a dialogue with them, but at the same time, I'm interested in not only doing history from below, but once I'm below, looking to the sides and see other things that they might have overlooked. And so, for example, I recently published an article that revised something that Angel Chuco Quintero had said in the 70s, and I sent them the article, and he took me out to lunch before the pandemic, and we talked about it for a long time. And so it was a way of, I did not want it to come across as if I was trying to go against what he was saying, but it was trying to engage in this transhistorical conversation. And so in the classroom, I think that translates into trying to foster critical thinking and using texts as guides for our discussions and our way of collectively producing knowledge, and not, again, from the punk community, I think kill your idols. And so it is a way of reading the text as produced by people and not necessarily by luminaires in any field. And yeah, and just humanizing the authors with students as well.
Yeah, I just want to add really quick what my colleagues have said. I've been very fortunate to research the Confederadas. I learned a lot from them about being generous, about being caring, about giving a lot, expecting nothing for the greater good. And also from my colleagues that a lot of you are here. So this is kind of very exciting. It's like a birthday party of sorts. So I learned from you all. I learned from you all, and you know, not only makes scholarship better, but it makes social justice. We create social justice when we do that and allow others to speak and to correct us, because otherwise how we learn, how we become better if we don't listen and pay attention to things and know that we keep improving or keep making mistakes, but we keep our eyes and ears open to comment. So I try to teach that to students too. I think they do it. I like the generation today. They are always free to tell me how they feel. And I love that, because when I was a student, my professors didn't want to hear about how I felt about anything.
Okay, and Montse, we have another question for you. I don't know if you can answer this one, but can you speak to Carmen Aldecoa's relationship with other women with similar ideas from Latin America, either via correspondence, physical relationships, etc.?
That's an area of research that needs expanding, because my book is kind of an introduction to this. It's a recovery, it's an archival recovery project. So now it's a lot of analysis and a lot of aspects, like Dr. Zimmer was saying, lots of things that need to be researched. And Aldecoa was in contact with different people, all scholars, because she was an adjunct in New York University. So I'm sure she met other scholars. She met a scholar from University of Florida. So a lot of people have papers from her. So this is an avenue to research, because especially women need to be recovered. I mean, even though this was a progressive and radical group, they didn't write the periodical, and if they wrote, they didn't sign their names, you know? In the case of Aldecoa, I think she was protecting her very, you know, she was an adjunct, so she had to be careful too, you know? I mean, the FBI was really the periodical. So it's very important that because of these Cold War eras and because of the gendered patriarchal culture is still prevalent in these radical groups, that we recover all. So if anyone is interested, I'll be happy to help. Yeah, it's a venue to recover Aldecoa. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, we have lots of really great questions. So another one that we had is, what relationship, if any, did the Spanish anti-fascists have with other Spanish speakers in New York City? And if they did have one, what was it like? Were they open to membership or support from other groups such as these?
Yeah, so these are different pillars. So we have the radical labor groups, but we also have the Hispanic societies that were cultural groups. But even in the cultural groups, you have mutual aid, so that if anybody needs a coffin, if anybody needs some glasses, if anybody needs something on the hospital, everybody chipped in. So all this was something that the Hispanic societies worked together. And they were like, when they organized events, they were careful. So they were careful to like, if the Puerto Ricans were doing something, then the anti-fascists weren't doing it, you know, so that everybody had a chance to promote, to fundraise. So this was transnational, trans-ethnic, and it was, even though I say the anarchism was evident because I see who was writing the paper, I see after reading the 40 years, you get to know who's who. But everybody was very inclusive. Everybody was welcome as long as they were against fascism. So they were in constant communication. Also, there were lots of rivalries, of course, like in any grassroots organization or cultural organizations, there were rivalries, but usually, for what I found, was always personal. It was also personal. It was due to a specific people, not the culture that the organization had. Yeah.
Okay, and this is the last question that I have. So if there's more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Montse, one of the questions we received was, to what extent did the anti-fascists in exile contribute to effectuating a democracy in Spain? And how can you measure such a contribution?
That's so hard to do, right? That's what the difficulty we have with the humanities. We always get that question, right? How, and that's so difficult. And I love it because it will make me try to find an answer. Obviously, we see that workers were smuggling censored news to the United States, so they were published. And the workers in the United States were smuggling newspapers in Spain, so that the resistance knew that the outside world were paying attention to them. So obviously, there was a resistance that the España Libre promoted and supported. That was the main goal. But the fascism was brutal. So people were killed all the time, right? And they had the power of the state. So it was very hard to compete with that. So when you have a state that kills people in big numbers and for any reason, with and still we cannot get to those archives because still we cannot get to those numbers, and a lot of that has been destroyed. I mean, we demand too much of the PU Confederadas, right? They didn't have any way to fight, but with their own bodies. They fight with their own bodies. I told you in the timeline, the first speech was Zugadi Garmendia. Well, he was killed in battle because he went to Spain. So the only thing they had was their bodies, their writing, their sleep hours that they didn't sleep, and the money that they save and give away. Because all these exiles, when you get to know about them, they had little clothes and little furniture. Everything went to fundraising. But that's all they had because nobody paid attention to them, right? So they were kind of left alone fighting for peace in Spain. So I think they contributed a lot. At least I hope they contributed to the future to know that we cannot disregard. I mean, in the past, we may have disregarded fights for social justice. So we cannot disregard them today because we're making the same mistakes.
Montse, I just want to jump in there and talk a little bit. It's not really about, it's not really a question, but in the chat, William made the point about social media today and the distortion of facts and the way that propaganda works on social media. So I think it seems that you have a lot to teach us in terms of how in the past text has been used as a form of protest, but I'm also thinking about the contemporary moment and William's point here about social media as like a tool of protest, but also has the potential to be oppressive.
Very
So
good.
I don't know if you had any comments about that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Very good, very good. And I will invite Jorell and Kenyon to help me. But the only thing I would say is that one of the things I want students and colleagues to know about the community I research, and this goes with the Italian communities and Puerto Rican, I mean, Jorell is writing a book about that, is how much instructed, how much learned these workers were, because they knew that by knowing they had power. So they read books, they researched, they went to conferences, and our students sometimes feel that's a lot of work. Well, guess what? I gave them a lot of power because they knew the stuff, not from fake news, not from the boss, but from themselves. So they spend long hours reading books, reading newspapers. Sailors, workers brought newspapers from Buenos Aires. The smuggled letters from Spain. They read all these accounts and then they make their own ideas of what was going on and printed the newspaper. So I hope this helps our generation and the next generation to do the gritty work of really enjoy learning because it gives us power. It gives us a lot of power. So Jorell and Kenyon, please. I don't want to talk too much.
Sure. Kenyon, do you want to go ahead or do you want me to jump in?
You go for it.
Okay, great. So I think that print media was a powerful tool used by the working classes throughout the Americas, particularly in the case of the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico. And I think that Kirk Schaefer's new book, Anarchists of the Caribbean, also documents this in a really neat way, in the way that print media allowed them to create networks in different transnational networks that were vibrant, in which they not only created their own local communities, but it was a way of communicating with other people. In Puerto Rico, the work that I do, I'm interested in the ways that print media also offered windows for workers to imagine themselves as global subjects And so participating, for example, in May Day protests, but also writing about May Day or reading about May Day in different parts of the world allowed them to feel as if when they participated in May Day protests in Puerto Rico, they were part of this global working class community, right? And I think it's also really important what Montse was mentioning in terms of the power of producing knowledge, because these communities were communities that were excluded from elite cultural institutions. Most of the people that we study did not go to college, did not go to school. The people that I study in Puerto Rico, the majority of them, the only education they got was from the workshop. Someone would read to them as they worked. And so they dedicated their time at night. They would steal time of night to read, to educate themselves. And in a way, it also allowed them to craft protean identities, because they were workers during the day, but they were radicals. And at night, they would be poets, they would be literatos, they would see themselves as playwrights. And so it's print media allowed them to not only connect with each other, but also allowed them to craft all sorts of identities. And those identities, I find them quite radical, because workers were not supposed to be playwrights. Workers were not supposed to be littérateurs. They were not supposed, but yet they were through their own process of self-education.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, that in a certain sense, right, not only the newspapers, but also the theatrical productions and the cartoons and so on, like these were sort of the social media of their day as well, in a certain sense, right? There's like little letters pages, or even like private messages that would be printed on, the back pages of radical periodicals, little updates, which are not that different from Facebook posts about like, this is what our local, group of anarchists and, this mining town did, and this is the play we put on. And the, reading about the theatrical productions in Montse's book, and they're using humor and satire, to critique fascism and critique the United States. And they're, it's not that different from like a TikTok video today, or, a YouTube video or a meme, right? These are sort of the memes of the time. So I would say, right, the question framed sort of social media today and then is maybe always disinformation, but it's also a tool that can be used in the opposite way, both then and today.
Thank you. We're out of time, but were there any final questions that anyone wanted to jump in with? Oh, like, Allah. All right, well, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Dr. Feu, and the book again, here is Fighting Fascist Spain. Okay, so if you haven't read it, definitely go out and get it. Thank you everyone for coming and dealing with the Zoom and the great questions in chat. All right, we'll see you later.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been wonderful seeing you all. I love you all.